I am excited to be here to talk about classroom systems. Hopefully you were all at Catherine Bradshaw's keynote. It was fantastic, and at least for me, it gave me a ton of information to process. And hopefully you've already mapped out your day this morning so you know the different sessions you're going to go to. At every session, you're going to be asked to consider a few questions. And so you'll see these every time someone opens up a PowerPoint. Since it's our first time today, the 4 questions are asking you to think about how the content applies back to where you are in your school district state. So where you're at with implementation, what the specific things are you're hoping to get out of a session, so kind of come in with a purpose, what you actually got out of the session, hopefully that's the same thing. And then what are you going to do with it? So as you guys know, this is not a traditional conference where you sit, enjoy, and then don't do anything with it. The goal is the content comes back with you. So for today, we're hoping to give you some great examples from the group of presenters. I'm presenting with Dr. Jen Freeman from the University of Connecticut, and Amy and Sherry are going to introduce themselves at the beginning, but they're phenomenal colleagues of ours at the University of Vermont. All right. So in case you're not as familiar with the implementation logic that we talk about, when we say phases of implementation, hopefully you're familiar with these stages, but exploration and adoption, installation, initial implementation, full implementation. Again, kind of think about where you're at based on where you're at in your school and district and how this content is going to map onto that and help you. They've given you fantastic tools to think about, so starting with where you are, thinking about where you want to go, and then the action planning piece is critical because we want you to take content back. And we also genuinely appreciate the feedback and use it. So please take time both in our session but also throughout the day to provide feedback. This is a conference where every presenter gets a graph of their session evaluations and their comments. So we can actually adjust how we present in the future. We can tweak who gets invited. So please take the time to do that feedback piece because we do use those data to make decisions. In case it's not already on your calendar, we have another fantastic national conference coming up in San Diego in March. So put PBIS on your calendar if you happen to have travel funds you can still spend. And now to the current topic, which is classrooms. So how many of you in the room are here because you are a classroom teacher and classroom management or classroom positive behavior support is something that you're still kind of working on? A few. How many of you are here because you are in schools, districts, and states, and part of your job is coaching and supporting teachers in your building? And you can raise your hand both times. So this session is going to be especially important for helping you think about the systems pieces, so how to really build systems to support educators. But we are going to spend a tiny bit of time in the first few minutes talking about the practices. So those of you guys that raised your hands in the first group, pay particular attention to what those practices look like. But for everybody, pay attention to the rest of the content, because frankly, the practices are easy. Getting them in place and supported is hard. So we have some guidance for you from the National Center that Jen will present, but Sherry and Amy are going to share a very cool model of what they're doing in Vermont that I think is a way that we can think about scaling classroom practices across a state. So hopefully that meets everybody's needs for coming in. So my job is to set us up by talking about practices. How many of you have seen us refer to this document? How many of you have read or opened this document? Okay. So this document has been around for a couple of years now. It's called Supporting and Responding to Student Behavior. This was a document that came out from the Office of Special Ed Programs, and it came out as a partnership of the National PBIS Center and OSEP. It was released at the 40th anniversary celebration of IDEA, so it was a really big deal. The federal government wanted to give guidance to schools and teachers on how to support kids in classrooms. So big deal because it was on the prevention side. It was also a very cool experience because a group of us from around the country got together to really think about what we know about classroom practices. So in this guide, for those of you especially who raised your hand still looking for kind of content for classroom management, we've tried to lay that content out in a way that's really accessible. So if you download the guide, which I highly recommend as opposed to printing it, if you download it, you can actually navigate the whole document through hyperlinks. So if you print it and read it, it might seem a little bit long, and we keep calling it a brief, but it's not actually brief. But if you actually download it, you can see that we've got hyperlinks between practices. So as we thought about the practices that are critical to classroom management or PBIS in the classroom, we thought about some practices that are foundational. They need to be in every classroom, and some of these can be in every classroom even before a kid sets foot in the classroom. So things like having your physical arrangement or your physical layout designed in a way that maximizes student success, minimizes crowding and disruptions. And Catherine talked this morning about the impact of the physical environment on students. She talked about that at a school and community-wide level. But we actually have research on that in the classroom as well. So when we can carefully design the physical environments of classrooms, we can set kids up for success. Another foundation, which you can do once you have kids, but ideally you've thought through ahead of time, is establishing clear routines. So how many of you on a pretty regular basis are in schools? Almost all of us. So just for a second, do a mental walkthrough of your building. Think about those classrooms where you can walk in as the outsider, so don't think about your own classroom for a second if you're still in the classroom. Think about the classrooms where as an outsider you can walk in, and not only is the physical arrangement set up, but there are things that prompt the routines in the classroom. Whether it's a schedule written up on the whiteboard, smartboard, whether it's a kid's agenda that has the key objectives they're learning that day, whether it's PEC symbols that are prompting the picture schedule of activities. Again, think of those classrooms where you from jump know what the routines are as soon as you set foot in the building or in the classroom. How many of you can think of that classroom? And then those of you who are in roles to support teachers, think about when you walk in the classroom of someone who's really struggling with classroom management. Are those same features in that classroom? Right? So these foundational pieces seem really simple, but those often are some of the key differences between classrooms that are really successful and classrooms that are struggling. So those simple things can actually have a pretty big impact throughout the school year. In addition to routines, having small numbers of positively stated expectations sets kids up for success. So most of us here are implementing school-wide PBIS. How many of you have been implementing school-wide for at least a year? How many more than 3 years? How many more than 5? More than 10? Awesome. So we all are familiar then with the matrix that has the school-wide expectations by the school-wide contexts. So playground, hallway, cafeteria, depending on your school level. How many of you have that same matrix in every classroom, but instead of settings, it's broken down by classroom routine? So entering and exiting the classroom, small group work, whatever the routines are, how many of you have that matrix for your classrooms? So some, that's awesome. But the idea of having those school-wide positively stated expectations installed in your classroom is really asking teachers to think about what those expectations look like in the context of classroom routines, and not think about it only, but explicitly teach it. So we all do, I think, a great job teaching those routines and those expectations across school-wide contexts, but inside classrooms having those same pieces in place. And we called those foundations because if you haven't taught expectations, it's really hard to hold kids accountable for them. And it's really hard to even know what to reinforce. And so we're really good at this in non-classroom settings, but we sometimes forget to get those same things into classrooms. So those are not brand new and different. It's just really thinking about bringing them in. Under prevention, we think about active supervision, so moving, scanning, interacting. Having kids actively engaged with opportunities to respond. So the more we can get kids actively engaged in instruction, the better their outcomes, both behaviorally and academically. So we always say good instruction is one of our best behavior management tools. Having systems to acknowledge kids, starting with specific praise. So catching kids when they're doing the right thing and telling them how great it is. And being preventative. So before we expect behavior, reminding them what that behavior looks like. On average, how often do you think teachers remember to prompt or remind kids ahead of when the behavior is expected? How many of you would say like once an hour, teachers provide a prompt? Once every couple hours? Once a minute? Across many studies, we have an average of 0. So it's one of the strategies that we think we do a lot, but we often forget to catch things before they happen. We wait until they happen and we correct and redirect. So the idea is to move those corrections and redirections up to the front end to remind kids what's expected. When kids do make a mistake, we move over to the response piece, and we do still do really good error corrections because that's an effective part of instruction. When we can, we move them to the front, but we do those. We also have other strategies we implement in a classroom setting to decrease problem behavior, and we have some additional tools in this document that'll help make those consequence decisions, I hope, even easier. The other thing we push in this document is the idea that teachers have to be using data to drive decision making. That's something we talk about all the time, right? But how many of you in your classrooms have teachers regularly collecting data on student behavior, beyond just office referrals, and using that data to inform their classroom behavior supports? Awesome. A few hands went up, which is better than none. But this is usually a growing edge for most schools. So in this guide, we're really pushing people to think about how they collect and use data. So all of those that I just did the very fast way, all of those are things you can click on, and in the document, it'll take you to a table, which I know you can't read, but you can download the document. In the table, for each one of those practices that I just did the fast way, it provides a description of critical features. It gives you examples of what it looks like in elementary schools, examples for secondary settings, non-examples, so common errors teachers make when they think they're doing that. And it gives you, I think the coolest part in some ways, links to resources. So the first couple bullet points summarize the literature, the research literature, but then when there are videos or books or especially free things that you can access, those are also hyperlinked. So this takes you from one document to a lot of different state websites and places that have rich content. The other thing it does is it pushes teachers, as I said, to use data to guide their decision making. So the first question we ask teachers to think about is, are they implementing everything we just talked about with fidelity? Because without that piece, you can't identify kids who aren't responding. So the first question is, are you doing everything we just said at a level that you would expect kids to respond? And then based on that, you can make some decisions about whether kids are responding and kind of what tier you would think about for intervention based on your data. So, this is in our guide still, thank you. So thinking about the guide, we have on our PBIS Center website, the guide presented in a slightly more user-friendly way. And so when you click on the website, you'll actually see this graphic as opposed to the other one, but it's the same exact content I just walked us through. And the decision tree I just mentioned, you can actually see in this version of the slide. So we're going to pause our content around practices, and we're going to now assume we're all completely fluent with this content. And we're going to move into thinking about how we do that in a systems framework.
A bunch of us work together on sort of figuring out what the classroom practices were, getting it into this not very brief. And it's a great resource. But the next challenge came like, okay, great, we know what the classroom practices are, but how do we make sure every teacher in our building is doing them? And we train a cohort of schools in Massachusetts, and we say you've got to push classroom. It's got to be part of your school-wide implementation. We're not going to ignore the classrooms, and they all nod and say, and they don't do it. And part of it was because there was this disconnect between thinking about, okay, identifying what we want teachers to do, and then identifying what the supports are that teachers need in order to be able to do those things successfully. So that's what this next sort of brief, not brief, that we put together will do. And this is also linked on PBIS.org. If you go to the same classroom section where you can find that first brief, the easiest way is to just scroll to the bottom of that page, and there, you can download this document as well. It's got a really long title because we do that for some reason. It has the keyword systems in it. So look for the word systems at the bottom of the classroom section on PBIS.org, and you'll find this document. This is your kind of quick overview of what it looks like. We'll go into this in a lot of detail, but this is what you're looking for. It mirrors the practices brief that Brandy just described. So we set up a couple of key questions and then a decision-making chart for you to think about, this time as a school leadership team or as a behavior coach in your school. How do I think about supporting my whole group of teachers? So now the teachers are kind of the people we're looking to support as opposed to the kids. So you've got the questions that we'll go through and then a decision-making tree that you can work on. And it's all hyperlinked, just like the practices brief. And it takes you to the same type of tables that Brandy just described for practices, except this time the practices talk about the systems features. What does coaching look like? How do we make sure classroom manages a priority in our building? Those sorts of things. And each table gives you examples of what that looks like, non-examples, and then it also links to resources that you can use for training your teachers, that you can use for booster sessions, all of those sorts of things. If you want to use it for virtual coaching, those are all available. Most of it or all of it is freely available. It's also your go-to place. There's a lot of regional websites in PBIS land. Missouri and Florida and the Midwest all have classroom resources. We've tried to consolidate them here. So this is your sort of one-stop shop for how you can get to all of those other resources. We also embedded a scenario at the end that sort of walks you through one way this might look from the school-wide perspective of how do I think about supporting all of the teachers in my school. So the scenario will help illustrate some of the things that are in it. So that's the overview of the document. We're going to now spend a little bit of time thinking about what the primary questions are for supporting teachers, and then Amy and Sherry are going to tell you what this looks like in Vermont, which is really cool. So the first primary question is, are there foundational systems in place to support, and we came up with a new acronym, PCBS, Positive Classroom Behavior Support. It's PBIS in the classroom, but for the OSEP document, they didn't want us to use PBIS, so we made a new acronym. It's the exact same thing. So we've not shifted content on you. It's exactly the same practices that Brandy just described. But we've got to think about, are those foundational pieces, just like Brandy talked about setting up the physical environment and having routines, what are the foundational things for setting teachers up for success? Then we're going to talk about, do the teachers know what they need to do? Do they recognize it when they see it? Do they know what it looks like when they're doing these strategies? And can they do it accurately? You think about sort of the phases of learning. That's the first thing we want them to be able to do. Can you do what we ask you to do? And do they know what that looks like? And then we're going to use data to guide our decision making, just like we do for kids. So are most of your teachers implementing with fidelity? What does that tell you you need to do? Are most of your teachers not implementing with fidelity? What's the response there? So we're going to use data to guide our practices for teacher support the same way we do for kids. So what are those foundational systems that support teacher success in implementing classroom practices? The first one is that classroom practices and the implementation of those practices has to be a clear building and ideally district priority. That somebody at the building level, at the district level, has to say out loud, in writing, classroom management's important, and we need to do this. Because it links to academic outcomes, because it links to school climate. But somebody needs to make that a clear priority in the building. So, for example, somebody connects the implementation of classroom management practices to your building-wide outcomes that you're working towards. You're working to improve school climate. You want to improve reading. You want whatever that is that you're working towards, you're going to link the implementation of classroom management to that. Make the connection between behavior support and academic support really explicit. We have a lot of teachers, particularly at the secondary level, who will say straight up, my job is to teach academics. And I don't want to spend my time on behavior. The good news is they go really closely together. And so when we make that connection, we give teachers an extra rationale for why this is important and why we're going to do this. And then we need to make sure that these strategies are adapted to fit the context in which they're going into. So you're going to set up your classroom differently if you teach 12th grade physics than if you teach kindergarten. It's the extreme example, but the way you train these has to be adjusted a little bit to the context that you're going into and make sure that it matches that context. The non-example is that data demonstrating the need for classroom practices isn't shared in your district. So nobody says this is actually an important thing. We don't actually need to do this in our district. The next piece that kind of follows along with priority, and the reason priority is important is because resources follow priorities. You guys have seen this happen over and over again in your buildings and schools. The new shiny thing, there's money for it, always. And there's not money for these other things that we've been doing forever. So when something's a priority, we find a way to get it done in schools. And that's why we need to make sure this connection's really explicit. So if somebody's going to say classroom management's really important, we're going to take the time and resources, time and money, to do it well. If we're going to invest in it, we're going to do it right. And so when we put resources behind our priorities, we're signaling to all of the teachers in the building that this is actually important, and we're going to support you in doing this. So we're going to have dedicated time for training, ideally during the school day or in a way that doesn't impact sort of teachers' free time, but also limits the impact on student instruction. But somewhere we're going to dedicate time for training. We're going to dedicate time for coaching. You guys have heard already in this conference, in the 1 hour or so that we've been going, the importance of coaching. Behavior change doesn't happen without that follow-up support, and it's true for kids, and it's true for us as adults as well. We need somebody to help prompt us along and make sure that that we're implementing, that we're transferring the learning that we have about what this practice looks like into an actual behavior in the classroom. We're going to use data to make sure that we're doing that and to make sure it's working, and we're going to celebrate staff who are implementing. So we have a student recognition system. When they meet our expectations, we can do the same thing for adults. We're going to recognize and celebrate the effort they're putting in to changing their classroom practices. It's not an easy thing to change the way you interact with kids, particularly when they're engaged in inappropriate behaviors. Our gut instinct is to respond the same way our parents did, the same way our teachers did, and particularly when we're stressed out, that's what we go back to. That effort to change the way you interact in those moments is a pretty big one. And acknowledging that and celebrating staff who are willing to put that effort in is a really key piece of what needs to happen in order for this to work. The non-example is you have no time or money to do this. You can't expect teachers to implement something if they've not been trained. We know from a number of different studies that we don't do a good job of training teachers in pre-service. We don't do a great job once they're hired on in a district either in directly teaching them what classroom management looks like. And that's on us at the university level. We try to change that, but it's really on us as a field. It's a huge waste of our collective resources to have teachers who don't know how to manage a classroom because we've not trained them. They then quit, the students don't achieve, and we have this turnover problem that you guys are all really familiar with. So investing in classroom management, it prevents a whole bunch of student and adult negative outcomes that we want to try to avoid. And then the last piece we need to think about in terms of those foundational pieces for staff is integration and alignment. And you guys will hear those words throughout this conference, and they've almost become sort of buzzwords that I don't think we slow down and operationalize very well sometimes. So what we mean here is that it's not fair to send a teacher to a classroom management training, a training on how to implement the new math curriculum, a training on how to implement the new science curriculum, and then expect them to put that all together on their own. We can do a lot better than that. We can talk about how do you do good classroom management while you're teaching math, because that's what we want them to do. We can integrate the trainings, we can integrate the content for teachers so that they learn how to do behavior management in the context of learning how to do good instruction. And by aligning those practices, you're not saying to teachers you have one more thing to do. You're saying this is good instruction. This is just plain old, this is your job, this one piece. Teach math and manage behavior go together. And so you're making those two things really explicit. And that doesn't happen at the classroom level. That happens either at the school level or ideally at the district level, so that when those PD days get planned, we're integrating it when we provide the PD. We're integrating when we provide coaching supports. And by doing that, you're setting teachers up for success right from the beginning. So those are the foundational practices that we think about before we really even get going. How do we make sure teachers are set up for success? Somebody said it's a priority. Somebody set aside time and money to support that. And it doesn't take a lot of money. We'll talk about sort of a range of ways you can do this. And somebody's thinking about how do we make this not one more thing on a teacher's plate. Those are your foundational systems. Just gave you those. Once those things are in place, to the greatest extent that you can get those in place before you get going, the next question is, do all my teachers know what I need to do? Do they know what those practices that Brandy just described are? Can they identify them? Can they do them? And do they know what it would look like in their classroom? And the way we do that is providing clear expectations, just like we do for kids. How do the kids know what the expectations are in the classroom or in the hallway? We teach them. We're going to do the same thing for teachers. We're not going to hold them accountable to something we've not taught. We're going to make sure that we provide training. So we're going to have clear expectations and explicit training, so that is somebody actually tells you directly what it is that you're supposed to do in the classroom. This is a specific praise statement. This is what it looks like. This is what it doesn't look like. This is what it would look like in your classroom for 9th graders who are in a lab setting. So we're making it really specific for teachers so they know exactly what it looks like. To the extent that you can, this should be job embedded. This is not go to a 3-day workshop off-site somewhere, learn about these strategies, and come back and do them all. These are we kind of say like this, the practices by themselves are the easy part. You can train somebody how to do opportunities to respond in about 15 minutes. So if you can get 20 minutes of a faculty meeting on a regular basis, you can train your teachers in how to do these practices. It doesn't take a ton of time to be able to do these, particularly if you break them out. So you're going to do job embedded. You're going to link it to school data. What are we already doing? What's our goal? And then here's the training to help us get there. The non-example is something we do pretty regularly when we think about classroom management, and that is we talk about theory. We talk about the idea that we want all kids to feel connected in the classroom and have meaningful relationships. And that is really, really important, but I don't know how to do that when you use those words. I know how to do that when you break it down and say, I'm going to feel connected to that classroom when somebody says hello to me when I walk in. And when somebody recognizes when I'm doing a good job and tells me that, then I'm going to feel connected. So we're going to make it really clear for teachers what it is that we want them to do and how it connects to those bigger important things, but we're not going to stop at those big important things. We're going to make sure we're being really clear about how we get to those goals. We also need to make sure that if you do break up your trainings into short little bits, that they're connected to a bigger picture. So getting a training in just specific praise or just opportunities to respond all by itself is not doing integration and alignment, what we just talked about. When you do that training, you're going to connect it to the bigger picture. How is this related to our overall classroom management, and how is this connected to academic improvement? We have already heard today that you can't just do training without doing coaching and performance feedback. So that has to be a follow-up to your training. The good news is there's more than one way to do that. A coach doesn't mean you have to have a person. It would be fantastic if we had a coach for every teacher in our country. We don't in Connecticut. You might in your state. I want to move to your state if you do. But for the most part, we're going to have to be a little bit more creative about how we think about coaching. So when we think about coaching, we don't think about people. We think about what are the critical things that coaches do that make that successful. And they do a couple of key things. They provide prompts and reminders of what you're working on. So somebody says, hey, remember we did that training on opportunities to respond? We're going to work on increasing that today. Just a reminder. That can be an email or a text message to your whole staff at the same time. It doesn't have to be an individual thing. So prompts are a really easy thing to build in for your staff. It can be a school-wide announcement. Hey, everybody, remember we're going to work on specific praise today. Coaches also provide data-based feedback, and we'll talk about a couple different examples of how you do this, but again, that doesn't have to be somebody goes in and spends 2 hours in each classroom individually taking data, graphing it, and giving it back to somebody. Teachers can take data on themselves. We can pair teachers up to take data on each other. And then you've freed up resources for the teachers who do need somebody with more expertise to go in and do that observation. But having some kind of database feedback is really key. So those supports can be provided by an external coach, an internal coach, your grade level team, or even yourself. And this guide provides examples that you can look at for exactly how to do those. And Amy and Sherry will give you some examples of how they're thinking about that up in Vermont. But I think that's a really important piece. It's where we stop sometimes with classroom implementation is, well, we don't have coaching resources, so we can't do it, or we just won't try. It's really important to think about the functions that a coach serves and what are some creative ways that we can get teachers to help support themselves. So this table breaks out how you can, what coaching looks like when it's provided by somebody else, what are some resources for peer coaching, and what are some resources for building teacher self-management skills? How can I monitor my own goals and my own data? And so there's resources that you can go to in the document for each of those things. Once teachers know what they need to do, they know what it looks like, and they've got some coaching supports in place to be able to translate it into their particular context and get feedback on how that's going, as a school-wide team, we're going to use data to guide what we do next, just like we do with kids. So the question is, I've done this training, I've provided coaching, are all the teachers in my building implementing those practices with fidelity? Some of you will have a fantastic group of staff who you provide training and coaching, and they are all off and running. Again, I'd like to move to your state because that's not what we've experienced in Connecticut. So the other part of this database decision-making tree is, I think, where most of us are. If that's not the case, if you provide training and coaching and you still have teachers who are not implementing classroom practices with fidelity, the next question is to think about the number of classrooms that still need support. How many teachers are we talking about? If you have 20 teachers in your building and 15 of them are still struggling, is that a tier 1 problem or a tier 2 problem? It's tier 1. So just like we think about it for kids, if we have a tier 1 problem in our building for kids, what do? We reteach. We're going to do the same thing for teachers. So if you have a lot of teachers that are struggling, those words are messed up, but if you've got a lot of teachers that are struggling, you're going to reteach. You're going to go back, do a booster session, provide some additional coaching supports, just like you would for kids. If you have a few teachers that are struggling, you're going to think about, how do I do tier 2 support for this group of teachers? Is it a particular grade level that needs additional support because they've got that group that's going through your school? Is it your new teachers that are struggling? And do they need a little bit additional support? Who is it that's struggling, and how can I give them an extra dose of that training, just like we think about for kids? The other piece we need to think about is, how severe are these problems? Because we're not going to leave teachers struggling with really significant implementation challenges. That response has to look different than if we have teachers that are struggling with minor pieces, like they can do the skill, but they're not doing it at the rate that we want them to do, or something like that. So we're going to think about the severity of the problem and the number of teachers that are struggling in our buildings, and we're going to use that information to guide our implementation as a team. So your leadership team will look at that data the same way you look at your school-wide kid data to guide your next professional development steps. Are you going to do a targeted group? Are you going to do another whole staff training? Are you going to provide some more specialized coaching to this teacher who's really struggling? The key here is we're thinking about this in an instructional framework, just like we would for kids. We're not saying this teacher's a bad teacher because they're not implementing this. They need support. They need training, and they need support in order to be able to do it. It's a supportive framework rather than a punitive one, which we tend to do pretty well with the kids, and we forget to do it for the grown-ups. So we're going to kind of think about those pieces. And we're going to use data to guide all of that, and this guide also provides some samples of how you can collect that data, because that's the other place. If we don't stop classroom implementation with the coaching, we stop it with the data, because we don't know what data to collect to know whether all of our teachers are doing it. There's a variety of different ways you can get this information at a school-wide level, and the brief gives you examples of what those look like. Yes? So the question is there any research that says how many is many and how many teachers is few? No. But we're thinking about the way we've been conceptualizing it. So there isn't hard research behind this. This is sort of the way we were thinking about it, though, is if we think about the triangle for teachers, we would expect, if we do a good job with tier 1 supports for teachers, about 80% of our teachers would be successful. And if we're not at that mark, then I'm going to want to build up that tier 1 system. That's an opinion rather than a research-based statement, but it's worked for everything else we've done in PBIS land, so I'm going to go with it until proven otherwise, I think. So the data piece is the other tricky part of this. And so this gives you ways that you can have teachers self-assess what they're doing. It gives you ways that you can have observers do quick walkthroughs and collect this information. And then it gives you specific tools for, okay, we've been focusing on this discrete skill, on specific praise. How do I get information just on that? How do I collect that data? So all of those are hyperlinked to specific examples. So I would really encourage you to spend some time in this document clicking on those links. Don't just read through it. The links are really where the meat is. So go in and take a look at those pieces. And like I said, we're thinking about this overall as a triangle for teachers. Most of our teachers want to do a good job. They're there for really good reasons. When we provide training, they're going to do their best. And when things get stressful, they're going to go back to what they've always done if they don't have those additional support. So we're going to make sure there's a clear tier 1 in place for all teachers so they know what it is and they've got that follow-up coaching support. We're going to use data to figure out who needs more. We're going to provide that targeted support to that group of people. And then you will have some teachers who need individualized consultation, and we know what that looks like. I know how to help individual teachers. The problem is I don't usually have the resources to help every single individual teacher. So this helps us kind of think about how to be more efficient in the way we deliver supports to teachers. So we're starting to think about sort of the triangle for teachers in the same way we do for kids. The systems brief provides, Steve Goodman came up with this table. It's too small for you to read, but it's brilliant. So take a look at it when you go into the document. It breaks out, so when we think about intensifying supports, that looks different depending on what the problem is, right? If somebody doesn't know what a skill looks like, I need to do something different than if somebody is having trouble fitting it into their context. So he broke out sort of the different ways that teachers struggle and suggestions for how do you intensify that support based on what the specific issue is for a teacher. So it's a really, there's a lot of sort of content within that table as well. Questions on that framework for supporting teachers before I turn it over to Sherry and Amy to tell you how they're doing this in Vermont? We send them somewhere else. The question is, what if the teachers don't want your help? And I would say we need to go back to those foundations pieces. If I'm dealing with an adult who says, I don't need or want your help, it's probably because they don't understand the importance of that skill, or they think they're already doing it, or they think it's not important. So I support a lot of high schools, and I deal with a lot of high school teachers who say, my job's to teach physics, I don't want to deal with behavior. So we talk a lot about, we change language a little bit. We talk about things like, all right, so we're not going to teach compliance, but we could teach social employability skills. We can teach kids how to collaborate with each other, and that becomes the focus. And so changing the language a little bit, but if we think about those foundational pieces, making it a priority, helping people understand why it's a priority for your building or for that classroom, will build that buy-in from teachers. The other piece is, if we think about that triangle for teachers, just like we did when we were rolling out school-wide PBIS, you're going to have those couple of teachers who say, I'm never going to do a reward system. It goes against my fundamental beliefs, and we're going to destroy children forever if we give them a ticket. We're going to ignore them for a little while, focus on the teachers that are doing a good job, get that ball rolling a little bit, and bring them in as your system is kind of built up and strong and ready to do that. So there's kind of a two-part answer to that. I would go back to those foundations, build up the priority piece. Why is this important for you and for your school? Or I might ignore them for a little while, focus on the teachers that are willing to work with me and get them up and running, show them then local data that say, look, when we do this, things get better in these classrooms. These teachers are less stressed. Their kids are more on task. They're learning more. Their grades go up. Those sorts of things. And then those teachers are more likely to get on board.
And they're the ones that call and need the help, the ones that don't.
They are absolutely the ones, right, yeah.
Right.
Yeah, but saying you call all the time, you need this doesn't always work, right?
Right, okay.
Other questions about the way we're sort of conceptualizing this? There's a lot of content in that brief, so we just went through it really quick, sort of big picture. I'm going to let Amy and Sherry talk about what this looks like in a really concrete example. But spend some time in the brief looking at the examples, looking at the non-examples, those common errors, and clicking on those links for examples.
Can you tell us one more time where to find the brief?
You find that brief by going to pbis.org. There's a little school bus icon. Click on that. And then there's a PBIS in the classroom that comes in that drop-down menu. When you scroll to the bottom of the PBIS classroom page, there's a resources box that has 2 documents in it. One is the practices brief that Brandy described, and the other is the systems brief. All right, I'm going to turn it over to Sherry.
Before I get started, can you hear me? Can you hear me? I'm not going to ask if you can see me. That's just, did the best I could. I wore my biggest shoes possible. But before I get started, I just want to say how awesome it feels to be here with Jen and Brandy. They have done so much to contribute to our field and to classroom supports in particular with the systems brief, with the classroom supports document, which I encourage you to keep on your computer so you can press on the links instead of print it out like I did because it's very hard to navigate otherwise. But they're helping us work smarter, and that's what we need in the busy work that we have. Okay. So our presentation is about making it happen, growing and building classroom behavior practice coaches in Vermont. And I think it is aptly titled, called Making It Happen. We're finally intentionally doing something to have schools have the capacity to support teachers in learning and using these skills and seeing how they're doing. For so many years, I'm the director of the state team for Vermont. And for so many years, we provided training to leadership teams at the universal level, which I'm sure some of you are trainers and you do training at the universal level. And the practices we supported them to bring back to their schools were identifying 3 to 5 expectations, teaching those expectations, and having really good acknowledgement responses to that, and consistent responses to problem behavior, all that. So we would provide this training to leadership teams and sort of cross our fingers, cross our toes, and really hope that that would transfer into the classroom, into all the classrooms, that they would really be the stewards to bring it back. It would go into the classroom, and our teachers would use those core practices, plus all that they learned in college, of course, on classroom management, to really support kids to be successful. And so it didn't happen that way. So we're intentionally making it work. Okay, before we describe the model, which Amy's going to do, a little bit about Vermont. I'm hoping you've all heard of it. It's the second smallest populated state in the country. What's that?
That's where Bernie Sanders came from.
That's right. We bring you Bernie Sanders and we bring you Ben & Jerry's, not to forget Ben & Jerry's. We also bring you a very small population, which the advantage of that is that as a state team, we're able to offer equitable supports to schools across the state. It allows for a network. All the PBIS schools are joining in a forum next week to really celebrate their successes. So we really have a bit of a Vermont PBIS family. And so that's really great. We have a lot of schools for the small population that we have. And I'm sure this is like some of your districts, this population, similar to some of your districts. So, take what you can from what we did and think about your district perhaps. We have like, schools with 40 students, 35 students. I went to a school one day and the principal, the part-time principal, was acting as nurse to put a Band-Aid on a student's finger, had to be greeting the bus, and was dealing with staff and talking with me about PBIS at the same time. So we just have some interesting, unique challenges. We also have a lot of supervisory unions, which are your districts, and a lot of school boards that we have to make sure we're communicating about PBIS success in districts. So focusing on classrooms, and got to be louder. Okay. We've been doing this for 10 years. We've scaled up pretty rapidly. We went from 3 schools in 2007 to 155 schools right now. I used to be taller, but it's been really wearing me down. So we've always been thinking about how we're going to do this and scale up and grow capacity in the schools. We, just so you know, we have about 80% of our schools completed the tiered fidelity inventory at Tier 1 this year, and 76% are implementing with fidelity. Yeah, pretty exciting. And we have a really high retention rate. We lose very, very few schools. We're continuing to provide supports. And this is why, because we have a cascade of supports. We really took implementation science to heart, and we have support at every level of PBIS. We have our state team, and we support trainers and coaches to work with the supervisory unions or the districts and the schools. And at the supervisory union level, there's a person identified who's worrying about PBIS for the schools. They're looking for resources. They're supporting schools in every way they can. Some with content in terms of behavioral consultation, but also with resources, where to find the professional development, how to plan the professional development, how to look at it across all the schools. And then at the school level, we have an identified person who is like the positive nag and is really making sure that the PBIS effort is front and center for their school. So that's, I think, what, and we get constantly giving each other feedback back and forth. That's why I think we have a really good track record. Now this might be a chart that looks familiar to you. You can see that these are office discipline referrals, and the highest one is classroom. Why do you suppose that's the case? They're in the classroom more than anywhere else. But when we add up all the other settings in the school, and that's the bar on the right, all locations except classroom, the classrooms are still significantly higher than every other setting in the school. So that really is also an indicator to us that we got to support teachers to really be able to manage behaviors in the classroom, which will support student achievement. And so if we know that our goal in Vermont is student achievement, and we know from the research that there's good teaching supported by classroom management that yields the student achievement. And that's sort of a selling point with our administrators to talk about classroom behavior practice coaches in Vermont. We also know, Jen referred to this, is that teachers receive very little pre-service training in classroom management. How many, raise your hand if you were trained in education, if you're an educator. Okay. Keep your hand raised if you had more than 3 credits on behavior management. Not as many, and wonderful. I'd like to know where you went to school. That's terrific. So we have that issue. Really, we just aren't necessarily preparing our teachers to do classroom management, use evidence-based practices for classroom management. And in Vermont, they have very little access to coaches. I mentioned our cascade of support, but really the administrator needs to apply for funding to get a coach to come into the school. And those coaches are not necessarily getting into the classrooms. They're working with leadership teams to support them, to support the classroom teachers. So we had to do something about that. So we created a goal that we are going to support schools to develop their own capacity to do classroom behavior practice coaching in their schools. We applied for IDEAB funds. You may be familiar with it. We had to do something new that hadn't been done before, and that built capacity. So with our Agency of Education in Vermont, we were able to access those funds, and we were going to do it for 1 year, pilot program to see how it goes. We brought in Brandy, thanks for being so close to Vermont. She's from Connecticut. And we made sure that what we did for our coaches that we identified was that it was both web-based and face-to-face with consultation following that. So it was not a lot of time out of the school and out of class. So Amy's going to talk to you a little bit more specifically about our model.
Okay. So we started at the beginning of last school year, and we introduced this concept to our schools. And it was an application process because we wanted it to be a small number of schools before we scaled up and supported many teachers in schools. They had to apply for this opportunity. And we really phrased it as an opportunity. It was free training for them. And so we had some selection criteria of who we ideally wanted to see as part of this training series. So we recommended that they send at least a team of 2 from their supervisory union, preferably someone from a school and someone from the supervisory union level or district level, so that they could provide that support across figuring out how they're going to scale this up to their whole district. They had to be implementing Tier 1 PBIS with fidelity. They had to have identified classroom management as a priority, like Jen and Brandy talked about. That foundational level had to be in place. They had to have some kind of proof that they had a supportive culture and adult acknowledgement system already in place. Their administrator had to endorse this as a priority and allow the school personnel out of the building for this training, and guarantee that they were going to have the time available in their schedules in whatever role they were to be able to train and coach the staff. So we had a wide variety of kinds of school personnel apply for this opportunity. We had some classroom teachers, we had some school counselors, we had some district school psychologists. So we had a range of people. We had some administrators, and we were very clear with the administrators that were accepted that all coaching and feedback was to be done in a non-punitive way, so that the teachers were seeing them as a coach and as a support versus as someone who's providing their evaluation, and these skills need to be in place for that reason. They had to be someone who already works for the school, so the school couldn't be thinking about who are they going to hire to do this work outside of the school. We wanted the coaches to have some existing skills in behavior management and data analysis. They had to commit to the full participation of the training series, and they had to agree to do some observation and data collection once they got back to their schools. So based on that criteria, we were really surprised to see that we had 45 applications from individual school personnel, and we thought we were going to only have 12 spots available. And so we kind of had to readjust and say, what is the most number of people we can physically support in this pilot, so that we don't have so many that have to be cut. And so Brandy said, let's go with 24, and so we went with 24. So we were able to have 24 people participate in this series, and we lost 3 throughout it. So by the end of June, we had 21 people who'd been trained as classroom behavior practice coaches. This will be in the PowerPoint. You can't read it, but this is the scoring rubric that we used. Once we got those 45 applications, we realized we couldn't just kind of anecdotally think about these people that had applied and whether we thought they were eligible or not. We really needed to create a scoring rubric to give us some hard numbers about who needed to be ruled out and who we needed to look at more closely. And that was just based on all of those criteria I said at the beginning, how closely they met those criteria or not, both on the school or district level and on the individual coach level. So as we reflected back on that process, once we got the applicants in the room, the participants in the room, we realized we didn't quite necessarily have the right people in every situation. So some people that looked really good on paper, once they were there with us, we were like, oh, they are not prepared for this at all. They do not have the skills they need. So we're really thinking this year about how to make the application process fit who is best suited for these roles in the school. At the district or school level, really thinking about how do we gauge whether that positive adult culture is in place. Some of the principals said, yeah, it's definitely in place. Our staff feel supported if it's not a punitive environment. And then when the coaches were in the room with us, they were like, I don't know how we're going to bring this back to our school because they're going to think that this is like a punishment system and it's all about teacher evaluation. And we're like, oh my God, how'd you get here? We also need to think more carefully about the skills and background of the coaches. I would say 80% of the people that ended up in the training didn't have the skills themselves in things like behavior-specific praise, opportunities to respond. Sometimes those things were new concepts to them. And so there was no way they were going to be able to go back and teach others about how to do those practices when they didn't know how to do them themselves. So once we had them in the room, we kind of backed up and realized we need to spend an entire day on the practices so that they know what they look like and don't look like, so that they're going to be able to train others. And that commitment to follow through. We also didn't spend a lot of time explicitly discussing what's the role of your school leadership team in this process. And so we ended up with some people in the room who weren't on their leadership team, didn't really have a connection to their PBIS leadership team. And so the leadership team had no idea that these individuals from the school were coming to this training and getting these skills. And so they weren't thinking about how are we going to bring this back to our staff as part of PBIS in our school? We also didn't get superintendent commitment, which is something we're thinking about for this year. And the importance of actually getting physical signatures. On one of the forms, we just said, you're principal and you just have to type that you're agreeing to these things. And there was no way to guarantee that the principal actually saw that form or the individual coach saw that form. So the basic model is that we at the state team are supporting the classroom behavior practice coaches, which is a whole nother new acronym. And the coaches are supporting the teachers in their schools. So like Sherry mentioned, we had 5 web-based sessions that were an hour long, and we had 2 face-to-face sessions. So the first one, like I said, in January was totally focused on the practices. We realized we had to schedule that follow-up one for May that was focused on the systems and how do you bring this back to your school and your district. And in between, we had kind of check-in web-based sessions to review and talk about how's this looking in your school. So that was very important to have this model of web-based so that because we did have classroom teachers and people who were very involved with students in their schools, that they weren't out of the building too much. We also had the opportunity to have Brandy provide follow-up consultation to them. So some coaches accessed Brandy quite a lot throughout this process, others just didn't. They were either better at using the resources on their own or they just weren't implementing it back at their school. And we also had a discussion board available for people to post questions to or resources to. They didn't really access that, but we had it there for them. So some things that we learned from this model is that we really need to have a kickoff event at the beginning that includes the whole leadership team so that the leadership team knows that this is happening and that there's someone in their building that is going to have these skills. They also requested a calendar of tasks of what they should be doing in their buildings month by month and what our expectations were. We also needed to stay better in touch with the administrators. They kind of were involved during the application process and then we lost them. And the coaches were saying, my administrator doesn't really know what's happening. And we also considered the opportunity to attach course credit to this because we were realizing this really is a lot of work for them and how can this be beneficial to them in more ways than one. So this was the data that kind of showed us this lacking administrator support and leadership team support. We surveyed all the coaches at the end of this series and they said their administrators knew what was going on. Their leadership team, not so much. Many of them disagreed that the leadership team understood this series. So that was the selection process, the model, and then the content that was provided was really based on those 2 guides that Brandy and Jen reviewed with you. They got that in depth. So an entire day on the practices, an entire day on the systems. And we really wanted them to be able to go back and present why this was necessary, why did we need to bring PBIS into the classroom, what are those critical practices that teachers need to have in their back pocket, and what does this look like for Vermont, and what does this look like in our school in particular. So like Jen mentioned, some schools had the capability to have this person be a behavior coach, and that was their entire job. And so they could do those walkthroughs and they could do that follow-up coaching versus we have classroom teachers that they have a full-time job already. They can't be doing as intensive level of support for their teachers. And so they needed to be really creative about teaching their staff how to self-monitor, how to have peer coaching opportunities. So they really had to think about in their context what's realistic, what are they going to have the time to do. So this was pretty exciting for us. The question was, how confident are you to say that you are a classroom behavior practice coach now after this training? And the majority of people really agreed with that statement. I noticed this year some of them have it in their signature on their email. I'm like, oh, that's awesome. So they have some pride in the fact that they've had this training and are doing this work in their schools. They also feel like their school is now in a place where they are ready for this level of support. So they've gotten their teachers used to the idea that they're going to be getting some feedback about their classroom practices in one way or another, and they're ready for that training and they're ready for that support. So that was also really exciting. They also believe in it themselves. So they believe that if teachers are given this training and build up these skills, it will have an impact on problem behaviors in the classroom. So that's a really important feature, that the coaches themselves believe that this work is important and it will make change in their schools. So these were just some quotes from the participants throughout the training series. Many of them really felt inspired and reinvigorated of doing it in their own work. So we had a school counselor who was teaching in the classrooms and was one of those ones who came in and didn't even know the phrase opportunities to respond. And then he started doing it himself and realized the impact it was having on his lessons and the students' engagement level. So he got to experience it for himself and share that experience with his staff. And he also worked with the teacher he chose to pilot this with was an experienced teacher who had been there for years and years, which sometimes might be a tough sell to them that they need to work on something. And he was able to experience success with that teacher because he was working alongside them, that we're both working on this skill and improving it. So this was him. The data on my self-assessment was very enlightening. Increased opportunities to respond can change a classroom. So we really felt positive about where we ended up in June. We felt a little nervous in January that this was going to happen at all, but they really boosted their confidence and their skills as the year went on. And then this August, the goal was for all of them to provide a half-day training on these practices to all of their staff at the universal level, and then decide what that follow-up coaching was going to look like. So that's what it looked like in Vermont. Like Sherry mentioned, we have a unique context. You might be thinking about how I could do this on a district level and provide this training. And the best part is, while Brandy is amazing and fantastic, and we were lucky to have her, everything that she taught them was in those 2 guides. So if you were a district level person and you wanted to be training classroom behavior practices in your district, you could be very well versed in those guides and provide a very similar training that Brandy did. So questions about how Vermont did it or about how the systems guide or practices guides can impact that? Yes? Yeah, so the question is, were we able to use any of the fidelity tools to kind of see how this is going? And it's still a little bit early for that because they just are rolling out in August. Most of what they did last year was just pilot work, but we did say to them that one of their possible data sources of how's this going in your school is, I believe there's a classroom question on the TFI. So it's just one piece of the TFI is how is this work impacting your school. Hopefully it will impact the entire TFI and increase your fidelity overall. We're also hoping that their office discipline referrals in the classroom will decrease, but still kind of too early to tell for that. This incoming cohort that will be starting this year, we're going to be doing more of that data collection so that hopefully it could be more research-based in the future. Any other questions? All right, so we will be up here if you have any individual questions you want to ask us.
Can I mention
Oh.
that they can find all the materials for this model?
Oh, yes. So on the Northeast PBIS website, NE-PBIS, there's a Vermont section. If you click on the Vermont on the map, and everything that Brandy trained and all the resources she provided the coaches is right there and available. All right, thank you guys so much.